They all know it is there, all the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it, others are content merely to know it is there. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the second episode in our series on dystopian horrors.
All right. Well, you probably guessed from the intro that today we're going to be talking about, I would say, the rather famous sci-fi story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin. So I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory on this, and we're going to put it into a more contemporary spin on it by also talking about the N.K. Jemisen story, The Ones Who Stay and Fight. So the Le Guin story comes to us from 1973. It was in the anthology New Dimensions 3. The story itself was nominated for a Locust, and it won the Hugo for Best Story. And Le Guin has said a few things about it. She's been interviewed about this story a lot. This is one of her more famous short stories. And she has said that it's about utilitarianism and the idea of a scapegoat. She quoted several, I think, surprising influences for that. So I say surprising because not a lot of her influences, at least the ones that she's talked about, came from the field of sci-fi. She talks a lot about, philosophy, and she threw in a few Russian literature classics in there. But she also, I thought this was kind of interesting. She talks about where she got the name for her utopia in the story, Omelas. She said that is from Salem, Oregon, because she was driving away from it and saw the sign that said Salem, Oregon in her car mirror. And so she only could see part of it from the car mirror, and it said Omelas. And she thought, well, that's as good of a name as any. So I thought that was kind of interesting that's where that story, that's where the title comes from. And this is, I think, pertinent to our discussion today. She did revisit the idea of Omelas, at least the people who walk away from it, in her story The Day Before the Revolution, which came out the year following. So that came out in the August 1974 issue of Galaxy magazine, which the story, you're going to see a trend here with Le Guin, but it won a Nebula and a Locust. It was also nominated for a Hugo. And I point that out because I think she wanted to continue the conversation at least a little bit and make it a little less of escapism of what was happening in the story. So like the people who walked away were not necessarily escaping what was happening, but were leaving in order to kind of better fight it, I guess. So The Day Before the Revolution, it ties into some of her other novels, but that one involves a character who was one of the ones who walked away. So just to kind of tie that connection in there for you. Now, the N.K. Jemisen story, The Ones Who Stay and Fight, is a direct response to the Le Guin story. And that's why I wanted to bring up the Le Guin's story that appeared in Galaxy magazine, because she did kind of continue that. But the Jemison story is really only in conversation with The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So this story was published in 2018. It was in her collection, How Long Till Black Future Month. Now, that's a really great collection if you want to go out and read some really good kind of sci-fi and speculative fiction. Several of her stories there, she has expanded into like longer either novellas or novels. But the book itself won an Alex Award and it won a Locus Award. And then it was collected again in Lightspeed magazine in their issue 116 in January 2020. And I mentioned the Lightspeed magazine one because that's available online. So if you want to go and read the Jemison response story, you can find it online. The LeGuin story is also online. It's also very widely anthologized, so I don't think that one is too hard to grab. But if you don't do want to read Jemison's response, you can. Um, since I don't think we've talked about Jemison much on this podcast, I want to mention a few things. She is notable just among today's speculative and sci-fi fiction writers. But she has the distinction of being the first Black writer to win a Hugo for Best Novel, and she was the first to win, I believe, 3 years in a row for that category. So that's pretty impressive. She also has a MacArthur Genius Grant that she got in 2020. So yeah, we're gonna, I think, first talk about the LeGuin story, and then we're gonna talk about Jemison's response story to that. Because we are talking about dystopian horrors, it's probably not so shocking that these both of these stories kind of deal with how quickly utopias can become dark, and there's kind of the idea that someone always is going to pay the price, or that something is always going to be repressed. This is stuff that we talked about in our last episode when we were kind of exploring the genesis of dystopian literature, and um, what really are some of the main themes that are coming about. But yeah, I think that's enough of me giving a little bit of background here. So I'm going to ask you, Matt, since you're here. Mel obviously couldn't join us for this, but we can't wait to have her back. But Matt, um, let's talk about the Ursula K. Le Guin story first. Had you read this one before?
I actually had not read this before. I'm shockingly fairly. I have not read a lot by Ursula Le Guin, and I'm sure that is probably big news. As much as I love sci-fi, she has always been on my list of things um, like to read. I've got several of her books, um, like on my to be read pile, and short stories as well. And this was my first time reading it, and I really liked it. I mean, I can definitely see why it won those awards. Like it's a it's surprisingly short story. In fact, it's really only uh I know we have a PDF is what we were reading it from. It's what, about 4 or 5 pages. Now it's kind of dense. If you were to double space it, make it a little bit easier to read, that would definitely make it quote unquote longer. But yeah, I was surprised by how short it was, but by how much she packed in there and conveyed in such a small space of words. And I really enjoyed it. And uh, I mean, I guess we should probably pause for a second and just admit to any readers, or excuse me, listeners out there, that there are going to be spoilers abounding, especially since both short stories are on the fairly short side. It's going to be pretty hard for us to not talk about everything in them. So if you haven't read the story and want it completely unspoiled, you can definitely find it online. It's a quick read. It'll take you probably 15 minutes at the most. And so go ahead, hit pause, come back when you're ready. Otherwise, we're going to barrel on through. But so yeah, the reveal that this utopia where everyone is happy, everything is perfect. There's no war, there's peace, everyone is cared for, and I'm going to put an asterisk on that because that's, as you were kind of hinting at, is the big reveal that it's not explained why or how, it just is, but that the entire social structure of peace, harmony, goodwill towards others is entirely dependent on what I can only refer to as horrific child abuse. It's a child who is kept locked in a tiny room, um, fed gruel like once, I think it was said once daily, maybe twice daily, but fed very minimally, no place, like no actual bathroom. It's they're just, going on the floor. It's like the horror stories that you hear about horrific cases of child abuse. Um, and that's the sacrifice that is made for this utopia to be utopia. And I mean, it really does very succinctly bring up that question, like you mentioned about LeGuin saying in the interview about utilitarianism. Um, a lot of the times I find myself leaning towards the idea of utilitarianism as the most practical moral application, just because there's it's going to be I don't want to say impossible, but it's very difficult to make things completely fair for everyone else. So to go with the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people is a compromise that is not the best compromise, but the most realistic one. But then, you read something like this and it's like, well, that's horrible. Nobody should be treated like that. And well, I mean, we can kind of talk about the title and how that plays into the ending. But anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but I really enjoyed it, and I thought that she really, I mean, it's a really powerful and thought provoking story that for something that is so short.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad that you kind of took that moment to define utilitarianism because it's been a long time since my college philosophy class. But yeah, this idea that kind of um the idea of like what's right and wrong in society is really like that kind of ethical system is defined by what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So if you're on the side of, where it's not really going to work out great for you, but it's going to work out great for 99% of the people, then that's what's considered like right and proper and um I don't know, not only just right, but I think like morally correct in this type of idea. Which I think is an important distinction when you're talking about these kind of things because it does I think work as um a different definition of how we kind of view morality. Um but yeah, I think you gave a really good description of it. There's this perfect place, and in fact when we are walked through the story, or walked through the town of Omelas. And I say that we are kind of walked through because it's almost like somebody is either walking us through and like describing what they're seeing and where we're an outsider coming in, or it's somebody who has come from Omelas and is telling us the story. Like the way Ursula Le Guin structures it, I guess, is that we are outsiders, but the person who's narrating is like an insider and is trying to give us a full picture of what is happening in Omelas. And I find it interesting that it's the festival of summer that's going on. So we're seeing it at kind of a high point of the year. It's not just this perfect world, but it's this increasingly beautiful, perfect day in this perfect world. um, and I don't know. I really like that, and that comes into play too in the Jemison response story, where we're kind of drawn in, and I think that is important. To kind of how these authors are speaking to each other. Um, but yeah, I've read this a few times, so this was not new to me. Um, but I always love it, and more so maybe this time than other times I thought a lot about Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, and it kind of colored my reading of the story this time, so I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, Matt. But so for those of you who don't remember, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery came out in 1948. So, I mean, you're talking a good few decades, before LeGuin would have published her story. And I don't know, I wasn't really looking when I was doing kind of the background research for this, so I don't know if LeGuin had read Shirley Jackson or if she was, um, particularly inspired by the story. It wouldn't surprise me if she was. But a few things that, like, stood out to me is the lottery opens in much of a similar way to this story, where you have a small town, everything seems very idyllic. Of course, I think Jackson is playing more with the idea of this being like a very kind of pastoral American uh, idea of a small town versus something that is so clearly not of Earth, the way Omelas is. Omelas is its own kind of universe, I guess. Um, but they both open with this really, like, beautiful, you're watching children and their parents, and you're seeing all the different people of the community come together, and it's a warm summer day, and everybody's excited, and school's out, and there's a festival going on, and, so it starts that way, but then it devolves into, I don't know, it just evolves into something so dark in both of the stories. But this is where I said I thought um it really colored my reading of it this time when I was thinking about Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. In The Lottery, Shirley Jackson plays with the idea that, I don't know, that the townspeople have largely forgotten why they hold the lottery every year. And for those of you who don't know, again, I'm going to spoil it, but the lottery essentially turns out to be a bad thing because they choose one person from the town every year and they kill them, by stoning them to death. So that's clearly like tied in with this like puritanical idea of, making a scapegoat, right? Um, and in the lottery, the people aren't sure why they do it, and they talk about how other towns who used to do it have now stopped, and there's kind of this rough idea that, oh, it keeps the crops going, and, um, we have to do this kind of like an appeasing of the gods type of thing. But people that they are even questioning whether or not it's a thing to continue. And I thought about with Omelas is because, and Matt, this is something that you had said that I found really interesting, is you were like, it's not really explained like how or why this child has to be treated in such a way in order for society to maintain its balance. Like there's no understanding. And from what I can tell reading the story, I don't think the people understand it either. I think they just accept it because they're taught so young. I think in the story it mentions that generally people are shown between the ages of 8 and 11. They're shown this child, just so they know they can like recognize this child's sacrifice for like everything that they have. And there's even questions about like where the child came from. Like, was the child, and again, I don't have the story pulled up in front of me, so I can't give the direct quote, but it was something like, was the child born with some sort of like something wrong and that's why it was chosen? Or was it neglected to the point that it's not educated, it's just really horrific. But my question is to you, Matt, is do we think it's something like in the lottery where maybe they've done this for so long and they haven't questioned it that the child really has nothing to do with their society at all? kind of like if they stop the lottery in Shirley Jackson's story, which is I think it's pretty clear that Jackson wants us to read it that way, that if they stop the lottery, crops would still grow just fine, you just like the other towns around it that had stopped it. So it makes the killing seem not only cruel, but useless. There's no reason behind it. And I wonder if the same thing was happening in Omelas where there was no reason for the child to be in that situation. And I think maybe her leaving, I don't know, it was just really interesting because nobody in the town seems to understand it either. They just accept it. It's which again, I'm trying not to jump ahead into the Jemison story because she does, I think, take that idea in an interesting direction. But I don't know. What do you think of that reading? Like, do you think the child really has anything to do with the perfect society?
I think that's a great question, and I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer, to be honest. LeGuin does a really good job of making it very ambiguous. I think it's a little bit clearer in Jackson's story that this could be stopped and like you said, the crops would continue to grow and everything would continue on as normal. But not only is it not clear how the child is chosen, whether or not, they, like you said, are they born for this? Are they chosen because of some sort of defect? Are they turned into this, um, like unsocialized creature because it's a random child put in there? I mean, a lot of the details are lacking, and I think that's one of the to be honest, one of the strengths of the story because it gives these multiple interpretations and these different levels of like ways to read it. Because I mean, I don't know. It's really not clear from the text of the story how much the treatment of the child is actually tied into this utopian society. Do the people of Omelas believe that it is? Absolutely, 100. Well, I won't say 100% because there are some that when they have this revealed to them, those are the ones that walk away. That those are the ones that choose to leave the society. But I don't know. It's so very ambiguous that I mean we don't really know for sure. But I mean I definitely think there's enough in the story to support that reading that you just did of well, I mean, who's to say that this could have been going on for such a long time and has been perpetuated down through the generations for so long that it really what it is now is not even what it started as and it's not what's keeping this society in check at all. It's just a like vestigial custom that's still being observed. I i don't know. I mean there's no clear cut answer to that, and that I think that very much is LeGuin's like purpose in doing it is to make you think of that question and to possibly even use that to examine some of the things that we do. Like are there societal rituals that we have that may serve a purpose but ultimately harm some small portion of society, or is there maybe something that we're still doing that's harming people that we don't even need to do any longer? Like all of those can be turned around to like shine the lens back on us as well. So I don't know. Don't I don't think I've answered your question so much as just complicated it even further. But I think that's one of the things I like about the story is that it doesn't give you the answer. It kind of leaves that up to you, the reader, to fill those gaps in yourself. Now, I mean, I can say as I was reading it, my thought was that I mean, I did kind of read it at face value as if the treatment of the child does keep the society intact in in its current state, but that is too much for some people to live with, and that's why they leave. And I read it that way just because um, I kind of chose to read it that way because I noticed all of the ambiguity, but um, I wanted to read it just at face value since I had not read it before and read through to the end. But it definitely was like something that I thought about, whether or not this could have simply been stopped and society have continued on and the world kept spinning, like they say.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think with both of these, and we'll talk about the Jemison story just right after I kind of respond to that. But I think in both of these there is a good bit of ambiguity, and I think it's meant to be uncomfortable for us as readers when we look at it. And I always read it, like I said, when well, I guess going back to, like, when I first read the story, I kind of did what you did, where I read it more on face value, and I thought it reminded me more of, like, ancient Rome and this idea of, like, keeping the masses entertained so that they don't question, what's going on. So this idea of, as long as you're putting on a good show for them, um, they're happy, they're entertained, they're not going to question what the Roman Empire is doing elsewhere. Um, it kind of struck me that way, and I still think that that's a reading that you can get, because when she talks about the ones who walk away, it's it's the idea that not many people do, right? More people than not stay in Omelas, and they find their own ways, I guess, to make reasons for why this has to happen in their head. They come up with some sort of moral high ground, I guess, and again, it's that idea of utilitarianism, that, well, that's just one child and it's horrible, but look at what all we have. Um and so not many people choose to walk away, and I think that's something that's really kind of important, especially, yeah, and again, I know we were talking about the Jemison story, which we will, but again, thinking about the Shirley Jackson story, in the lottery, everybody has the potential to pay the price for what, like, the utopia is, right? Like, every year your number can come up, or one of your loved ones' number can come up. And so everybody pays a part in this sacrifice, which makes me wonder if that's why we are seeing the other towns dismantle this idea of essentially utilitarianism. um because they are part of the sacrifice, right? But in something like this, and this I think does cut deep when you look at our own society, like you were talking about, Matt, of, like, what are we ignoring? Um, in Omelas, I think the majority of the people can go about their day and their life and kind of forget that that child is in that cellar, because they know they will never have to pay that price. Their family will never have to pay that price. Their friends will never have to pay that price. And I think when Jemison starts bringing into, and again, this is gonna be my nice little segue, so you can thank me for this nice segue, Matt. But this idea of, like, when you start putting it into the context of, like, racism or sexism or homophobia or religious intolerance, um, if you're the ones who are enjoying all the benefits and not paying the price, and because of how society is structured, that you're not going to pay that price, it becomes a lot easier to stay. And I think that that is something that's really interesting in what LeGuin does. And so I'm going to use that, like I said, as our segue into the Jemison story. Matt, before I get your thoughts on it, I'm going to give our readers a brief rundown of the story. So again, if you haven't read it and you want to, it's a short one. Go head over to Lightspeed magazine, hit pause, read it, come back. Okay, now I'm going to spoil it. Jemisen's story starts in the same way that the LeGuin story starts. And it's structured the same way too. We are implicated as readers in the story. The narrator is talking to us and is describing this place to us. So in this case, it is a city called Halat. There's another festival going on. This one is celebrating birds and butterflies and farmers, and everybody's walking around with wings on their back that they've made. And it just seems like this beautiful, wonderful festival. It's called the Day of Good Birds. But we find out that Halat is it's this kind of perfect place. Um, but there are these people who the narrator relates to social workers. It's very clear that I think the narrator knows we are American reading this story, and that's the way I read it anyway, because it does talk about how there are bridges between this world and our world, and that ends up becoming a problem later. Um, and it also has ties to Omelas too, which also is a problem because it calls America barbaric, but it also calls Omelas a tick of a city, fat and happy with his head buried in a tortured child. So it's this idea that there are other places that put themselves up to be utopias, but are doing horrible things. And in this story, the people who are the like social workers, basically their job is to find people who are infected. And the way they say if you're infected, it's if you have either come from one of these other places or you've somehow gotten knowledge of these other places, and now you're going to spread your like hateful world views. I don't know why that was so hard for me to say. World views. So it's this idea of like the disease might be that you might take this like hate and greed and racism from other civilizations, and you might then spread it in Umhalat, and that will dismantle what they have built, which is this perfect world where people care for each other. And it's a system. They see it as if they can find the disease and they can kill it, that it protects inequality from spreading because they have this like perfectly equal society. And there's also a child there. Now, they say the child is diseased, but they don't kill the child. They end up offering a hand to the child and kind of leaving it a bit ambiguous, but saying, if we can teach this child our ways and it can like not have the disease anymore, then it can live with us. Okay, so that's this idea. So it's the idea that if you see something that isn't working, you don't leave, but you stay and fight. And it asks you, the reader, if you are going to be able to fight to help the child and not walk away. So that is just a kind of breakdown of the story in and of itself. It's very similar to the Omelas story in structure and in theme, but she takes it to a very different place, and she's in direct response to that story. Okay, Matt, what did you think of the Jemison story? I'm really curious because this was I have not read the Jemison story as much as I had the LeGuin story. Um, but considering it's your first time reading both and you kind of read both of them one right after the other, I'm very curious to hear your notes on this.
So, just as a kind of a side note, one of my favorite things in all of British history, or I guess British literature, is the poems, "The Passionate Shepherd to His Love" and "The Nymph's Reply to the Shepherd," because I love the idea of one author responding to another by taking the same form or format and doing their own take or spin on it. So when you first suggested doing both of these stories, well, obviously I had not read the LeGuin story and I had not read Jemisen's story either, but I was already just on board because I love the idea of Jemisen, who is someone I have read other works by, actually. So I was familiar with her work prior. Uh, well, I was familiar with LeGuin, but anyway. Point being, I loved the idea of, oh, here's somebody coming along later and writing their own take on the story and kind of response to it. Loved the idea. So, um, all of that to say, I think Jemisin's is really an interesting response to it, and like you alluded to it, I so wanted to kind of chime in, but I knew you were trying to segue from the LeGuin to the Jemison story. But something that you said about the LeGuin story being that the drawback, the downside, the darker side of utilitarianism, especially in Le Guin's version of it, is like you said, this idea of it making it easier to normalize this mistreatment, that, well, it's not happening to me, it's not happening to my family. I think, quite honestly, that's something that people, not just in America, but most of the developed world, and I hate to use that word, but I don't know the best uh, term for it, but that's kind of the way we tend to look at, well, we don't call it the third world anymore, but developing nations. You know, we don't see that harsh poverty. All we see is the product of it, which maybe is, you know, a phone manufactured in China or something else. So you could very easily apply Le Guin perspective to it, and I think, like you identified, Jemison does a really incredible job of pointing out that kind of the, I wouldn't say inverse to leaving because you don't agree with the society, but it's not an inverse, but it's definitely another response. And from what I gather, Jemison believes the correct response is, like you said, you instead of walking away from the injustice, you stay there and you fight it and you fight back against it and you keep it from spreading, and that's how you create a perfect society. um now I mean, Jemison herself in her story, I mean, this is one of the things that I really liked about it, though, is like she, even in the story, fully admits that this is not a painless or even necessarily bloodless process, because it does involve like rooting rooting out this infectious and dangerous idea is does involve killing the adults. And you know, I think as a science fiction writer, she's probably also very aware of and toying with the idea that this is a good idea, but it could also fall into and create its own dystopia, because it does bring up that question of, well, who determines what the right thoughts are, and what if that changes, or what if, you know, as society progresses, that morphs slowly and it becomes less fair and egalitarian. You could see that sliding into some sort of fascism as well. So um I don't know. I mean, I like her take, and I definitely am on the side of fighting the injustice rather than just walking away from it and letting it continue. But at the same time, she raises other questions too that are, I think, equally problematic.
Yeah, this story is, I think, a lot like the Le Guin story in that there's not going to she doesn't offer us an easy reading of it, and I think I think that that's intentional, but I think it can be frustrating for readers, but I think the way you described it is really kind of perfect because Umhalat, I mean, it does seem to be a different, you know, a different type of utopia than Omelas was. Um, as it said, it's not gonna be a tick that's gonna grow fat on the back of an abused child. Um, and this is something that they're going to do. And but again, there's just, and I'm looking for some, okay, here's how they explain it. Okay, she's describing the people here. Okay, you have seen how they love their children, how they honor honest, clever labor. You perhaps have noted their many elders, for I have mentioned them in passing. In Umhalat, people live long and richly with good health for as long as fate and choice and medicine permits. Every child knows opportunity. Every parent has a life. There are some who go without housing, but they can have an apartment if they wish. Here, the spaces under bridges are swept daily, and benches have light padding for comfort. They do not live badly. If these itinerant folk dwell also in delusions, they are kept from weapons or places that might do them harm, where they risk disease or injury. They are prevented or cared for if matters get out of hand. We shall speak more of the caretaker soon. So it's like this perfect world, but at the same time, here she is describing essentially like an unhoused population in a way that I'm kind of like, well, is she just dressing up the language to make us feel better about that? Like, okay, they can have apartments if they wish, but what does that mean? You know? Um, And then it says, so this is a city whose inhabitants simply care for one another. That is a city's purpose, they believe, not merely to generate revenue or energy or products, but to shelter and nurture the people who do those things, which is, again, that's a wonderful thing. And then she talks about how they value like diversity and how so many people who live there have come from other places. And so you'll see, you know, so here she describes it. She says, people in this land come from many others, and it shows in sheen of skin and kink of hair and plumpness of lip and hip. If one wanders the streets where the workers and artisans do their work, there are slightly more people with dark skin. If one strolls the corridors of the executive tower, there are a few extra dun and pale. There is history rather than malice in this, and it is still being actively, intentionally corrected because the people of Umhalat are not naive believers in good intentions as the solution to all ills. So it's like this isn't quite a utopia yet. She's the narrator is, I'm saying she, but I guess we don't know that it's a she. The narrator is saying that like there is some sort of difference. Even though diversity is welcomed and respected, there still is some, you can see inequality, but they're working to address that, which is interesting. But then this is where it really, for me, kind of hits the point. And she still hasn't talked about these caretakers yet. We don't actually see the caretakers killing the man until towards the end of the story. She says, "Does that seem wrong to you? It should not. The trouble is that we have a bad habit, encouraged by those concealing ill intent, of insisting that people already suffering should be inflicted with further unnecessary pain. This is the paradox of tolerance, the treason of free speech. We hesitate to admit that some people are just fucking evil and need to be stopped." Um, and it's like you said, Matt, with that, part of me is like, yes, some people are. Um, there is no question about it. I've lived long enough in this world to see that. But then you think, well, who is the one defining that? And I think that's where it starts to get really sticky. And they go on later after the death of the man, and the, I guess, quote unquote, saving of the child. the narrator says, Umhalat has chosen to be better, but sometimes only by blood sacrifice may true evil be kept at bay. And then that's when she starts talking to us, or the narrator starts talking to us, the reader. And now we come to you, my friend, my little soldier. See what I've done? So insidious, these little thoughts, going both ways along the quantum path. Um, I don't know. I think that's it's a really interesting story when the narrator asked us and tells us, like, here's my hand, take it, please. Good. Now let's get to work. It's this idea, I think, that we all are implicated in doing the hard work. Um, but we have to be mindful because there still could be something sinister even in that. Um, it's a really, I think, a really good response, and I'm like you, Matt, I like it when authors do that, like, um, who was it? The Marlowe and Raleigh talking to each other in those poems you were talking about, yeah, I love those, but yeah, it's something that's really interesting, and I think what makes this an interesting bridge point between, like, the Jackson story and the LeGuin story is, I would say that the people of Halat recognize that if they have it good, it's because they're all working together to keep it that way. Nobody is just recognizing that, well, I have it good, so it's okay if one child suffers. Or, well, we have to keep it good for everybody, so I might have to make a sacrifice. That it ends up being, okay, we have to do the work. But then it comes down to this idea of, like, I don't know. It's still it's asking, how comfortable are we in this? And I think that's the point. I think we're supposed to feel uncomfortable in answering that question. It should not be an easy answer. Um I don't know. I love this story. I love this story so much.
Well, I agree, and I think the fact that it's not an easy decision is, uh, no, it feels very intentional. And like you said, you found the quote from the story where she talks about the paradox of tolerance, and that's something that I had a philosophy minor in undergrad and continued to have a interest in philosophy for a long time. Haven't really read a lot lately, but still entertain the ideas. And that was something that came up, was the paradox of tolerance, because to be truly tolerant, you have to be tolerant of all beliefs, and that includes beliefs of intolerance. So, do you tolerate the beliefs that are intolerant of other beliefs? And Jemisen's story makes a very clear and emphatic hell no. But you fight those and you cut them out like a tumor, which, um, yeah. I mean, at the surface level, I 100% agree with. I mean, when you talk about, like, uh, something like racism, sexism, like these things that literally are intolerant of other people, of their actual existence. I personally don't think that we should tolerate that, but yeah, I mean, it, it becomes a stickier situation because, like, again, who's to say what the who's the arbiter of it all? Who makes the decision? What point of view is saying this is what we are okay with and this is what we're not okay with? Because, I mean, again, I think that's the whole point of the story, like you said, is that you're supposed to be asking yourself these questions afterwards. Like, okay, well, I do agree with you, but man, I don't know. if this does actually create a good, perfect society from it, or if the Umhalat society could actually exist based on these principles. I don't know. It's I think both of these stories are. I would use the phrase thought experiments is kind of what both of them ultimately are. Is that they're taking these ideas and following them to certain conclusions, but also forcing you, the reader, to interact with it and kind of figure out where do you stand in all of this. I think the part of the point of LeGuin's story is it never asks you outright, but I definitely think one of the takeaways from reading it is what would you do in this situation? Would you stay in the perfect society and ignore the abused child, or not ignore it but accept it as a necessary evil? Same with Jemison. Like, where do you stand on this? Rooting out of intolerance? Like, yes, we should be intolerant of intolerance, and only that. But I don't know. They both force you to grapple with these questions, and I certainly don't have answers to any of them. I mean, I like to think that I do, but then as soon as I start following any of them further to logical conclusions, I get more and more muddied because it forces me to rethink my positions. And well, I mean, that's part of the fun of philosophy in general. But it's not for the faint of heart. It's going to have you always questioning your beliefs at all times. But yeah, anyway, I feel like half of my comments this episode have felt like rambling to me. But um, I don't know. I'm kind of stumbling for a way to end and sum that up what I just said. But yes.
Well, I think you're right. I think when you start following the kind of philosophical roads that these stories are leading you down, it's gonna kind of tug at a thread. Um, and not that I want to go into any sort of Duridian kind of theory. Um, but I will say that all three of these stories are pointing out we live in a world where there is a child that we have to fight for. And I'm using that, metaphorically, but you brought up the idea of like consumerism earlier when you were talking, and, you said, like we're fine going and buying our phone without thinking about the child halfway across the world that's making it in a factory, right? Um, or the adult. It doesn't age doesn't matter here, but I think that also goes with any sort of like privilege that you have in the world. Whether that is, economic privilege or racial privilege. I mean, we're, two white podcasters sitting here talking about these stories. So I do think that we all reading this, and I think that's why I love the fact that the two stories. I mean, Shirley Jackson's doesn't do this so much, but the later two stories, the LeGuin story and the Jemison story, both talk directly to the reader and implicate us in the story, because we are the person who essentially is ignoring the child in order to live our life. And there's probably multiple ways that you could read that. There's probably multiple children that we're ignoring. And the thing I think I love so much about Jemison's is that it does kind of end with, like, yeah, I've laid a lot of heavy stuff on you. There's quite a bit of ambiguity in here. There's quite a bit of acknowledging that this is not going to be a perfect dismantling of it, but she does kind of point us into the direction of, okay, get to work. Um, Otherwise, I think, again, because this is in conversation with the LeGuin story, if we're not getting to work, then we're the ones who are staying in Omelas. Um, which is heavy. It's heavy for a sci-fi story. All right. Well, I think that is a pretty good note to end on. These are heavy stories, but I'm glad we got to talk about them. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. And we have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. We also have merchandise available at our website, nofearcast.com. You can also simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help us immensely by pushing our podcast out to other new listeners. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.